The Strait of Hormuz did not just trigger an oil shock. It quietly changed Canada's place in the world. That is the real story here. And I think most people are still missing it because they are watching the wrong drama. They are staring at the strait, at the tankers, at the price spike, at the panic. All of that matters. But the more important thing is what happened after the panic. When Hormuz effectively shut down, the world's first reaction was fear. 150 tankers stranded, roughly one-fifth of daily global oil supply trapped behind a narrow waterway, suddenly behaving less like a trade route and more like a military liability. Prices ripped upward. Asian manufacturing economies started doing the arithmetic that no industrial state ever wants to do in public. How long can the machines run if the molecules do not arrive? That is the question that matters in a real energy crisis. Not the rhetoric, not the market commentary, the molecules. And once the molecules became uncertain in the Gulf, Asia did not just need oil, it needed secure oil. That is the shift in a stable world. Buyers optimize for efficiency, cheapest route, fastest route, familiar route. In a breaking world, buyers optimize for survival. They want the barrel that can still move. They want the supplier that does not have to pass through a war zone. They want the route that does not have to ask permission from missiles, militias, insurance panic, naval escorts, or geopolitical brinkmanship. That is exactly why Canada suddenly mattered. The hidden story inside this crisis is that while the world was watching the Gulf freeze, buyers in Asia were quietly redrawing their own map. The barrel they needed was not simply a Middle Eastern barrel from the nearest producer. It was a politically boring barrel that could leave a secure coast, cross the Pacific, and arrive without gambling on the future of Hormuz. That sounds unglamorous. In geopolitics, unglamorous is often another word for powerful. Look at the position Canada suddenly found itself in. Its refined petroleum sector just posted the highest production year in the country's history. Crude output averaged 5.3 million barrels per Dalton Y. Those are big numbers, yes, but big numbers alone are never enough. The real question in a crisis is not whether you can produce it, is whether you can deliver. And delivery is where geography turns into leverage. That is why the Trans-Mountain route matters so much for years. People talked about Canadian pipeline politics as though the fight was mainly domestic, environmental disputes, provincial resentment, federal indecision, construction, overruns, cultural warfare. All of that was real, but all of that also missed the bigger truth. The bigger truth is that infrastructure becomes most visible when the world breaks. That is what is happening now. Canada has a route to the Pacific. That route bypasses Hormuz. It bypasses the Red Sea. It bypasses the most dangerous geopolitical bottlenecks on the map. That means Canadian barrels now carry something that matters more than distance. They carry certainty, and certainty in the middle of an oil shock is worth a premium. This is why Chinese buyers became the largest customer base on the line. This is why South Korean refiners moved quickly. This is why the old idea of Canada as merely a neighborly supplier inside a North American system now feels too small. Canada is no longer only a producer in this moment. Canada is an alternative corridor that is a bigger role, and once you understand that, you also understand why the leverage picture is changing in a way Washington may not fully appreciate yet. For years, the standard assumption in North American trade politics was that the United States held the overwhelming structural advantage. America was the larger market, the larger economy, the larger political gravity field. Canada needed access. Washington could grant or threaten it. That assumption has not disappeared, but physical markets have a way of humiliating political arrogance. The U.S. Gulf Coast is built around refineries that require specific types of crude, including heavy crude. Historically, those refineries could look to Canada, the Middle East, and Venezuela. But now Middle Eastern flows are insecure and Venezuelan flows remain unreliable. That leaves Canada looking much more important at exactly the moment. Canada also has a Pacific route feeding demand in Asia. That is what changes the negotiation. Canada is no longer simply trying to preserve access to a dominant market. Canada is holding a stream of barrels that two different industrial systems want at the same time. Asia wants secure molecules. The U.S. Gulf Coast wants feedstock. That is not theory. That is leverage. And once leverage becomes physical, trade politics stops sounding abstract. You are no longer arguing over principle. You are arguing over access. That is why the Prairie Connector proposal matters more than most people think. Another 450,000 barrels per Dalton Y into the U.S. is not just infrastructure. It is a bargaining chip. It gives Ottawa something much harder than a talking point. It gives Ottawa an actual asset that can be placed on the table, while Washington is still pretending the old hierarchy has not shifted. This is why I think the Hormuz crisis has done something psychologically important inside Canada too. For years, Canadian energy politics often had a defensive tone. The sector was large but politically embarrassed, strategic but contested, wealth generating but constantly framed as a problem to be explained away. Then the world hit an energy choke point, and suddenly the infrastructure Canada had quietly fought over for years started doing exactly what strategic infrastructure is supposed to do. It created resilience, it created options, it created export power, it created bargaining power. It gave the country a way to absorb external disorder and convert it into internal strength. That matters. It matters not just for producers, but for pension funds, royalty revenues, provincial budgets, public spending, even the political feeling that the country is not merely exposed to global events, but can actually shape them in some limited way. That is what leverage feels like domestically, not just abstract strength control, or at least more control than before. But this is exactly where the analysis has to stay honest, because the advantage is real. It is also not permanent by default. That is the next battle. Whenever Middle Eastern shipping normalizes, some buyers will drift back toward geographically closer suppliers. That is what markets do. And pipeline capacity to Canada, West Coast, is not infinite. The route is valuable precisely because it exists, but it still has hard physical limits. That means this moment is not a permanent transformation yet. It is a window, and windows close. If Canada wants to turn this from a lucky crisis dividend into lasting structural power, it has to use the shock to lock in long-term relationships, not just spot sales, contracts, not just temporary premium pricing, permanent credibility, not just emergency rerouting, durable trade architecture. That is the real opportunity. And then comes the contradiction that cannot be wished away: climate, because every barrel that strengthens Canada in the short term intensifies the long-term political tension. Record output creates wealth, leverage, and resilience, but it also collides directly with net zero commitments, carbon pricing battles, and the question of how a country presents itself as climate serious while becoming more strategically valuable because of hydrocarbon strength. That contradiction does not disappear just because the world suddenly needs your oil. In fact, it gets sharper. Success makes the contradiction harder to hide. That is why this moment is bigger than a boom. It is a test of statecraft. Real statecraft is not choosing between leverage and friction. Real statecraft is learning how to survive. Having both Canada is now in that position. What looked like a domestic pipeline argument has become part of a global rerouting story. What looked like surplus capacity has become geopolitical insurance. What looked like a backup route has become a preferred route. That is the larger lesson of the whole crisis. The old world rewarded efficiency first. The new world rewards resilience first. The old world assumed the shortest route would win. The new world gives the premium to the route that still works when the shortest one becomes a battlefield. That is what changed when Hormuz shut down. And that is why I think the deepest meaning of this moment is not that Canada had more oil. It is that Canada had a way to move it without asking the Middle East for permission. That is a different kind of power, not flashy power, not military power, but real power all the same. And if you want the whole story compressed into one line, it is this: when Hormuz stopped looking like a highway and started looking like a trap, Canada stopped looking like a secondary supplier and started looking like strategic leverage hiding in plain sight.